Good evening. We're going to try to get started so we can finish promptly at 8, since we know there are people that really do need to leave at 8. So my name is Bernie Hershberger. I'm the director of the Counseling Center and Wellness Programs here at Bowdoin College. We are very excited to have a Bowdoin alum and someone who has done so much work in the field of prevention regarding suicide, mental health resiliency. We have had trainings all day, and they have been fabulous. So you're in for a treat. Let's see. I want to acknowledge sponsors of this program, Midcoast Hospital as a sponsor, along with Bowdoin College. So thank you, Midcoast. It's great to have you here. As a psychologist and mental health advocate, faculty member, and survival of her brother's suicide, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas sees the issues of mental health promotion and suicide prevention from many perspectives. She currently serves as the CEO and co-founder of the Carson J. Spencer Foundation, a Colorado-based nonprofit dedicated to helping leaders and communities sustain a passion for living through innovative approaches to suicide prevention. In addition, she holds leadership positions with the American Association of Suicidology, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and the International Association of Suicide Prevention. Sally has written 4 books on mental health and has presented to national and international audiences on topics of leadership, mental resiliency, and suicide. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas. I will say one more thing. This is being streamed live, so at the end, when Dr. Spencer-Thomas is going to take some questions, if you don't want to be seen live asking your question for some reason, which is really fine, you could come up and ask her later. But otherwise, when you raise your hand to answer a question, you will be on a live streaming source, however that works. So, thank you.
Albert Einstein failed his freshman entrance exam. What if he had died by suicide instead of going on to make his discoveries? Marie Curie, many of you might know her from her discovery of the element of radium. But what you might not know about her is that when she was a young adult, she lost her mother unexpectedly, and the loss was so devastating to her that she needed to be hospitalized for her depression. What if she had died by suicide instead of going on to win 2 Nobel Prizes in science? Martin Luther King certainly lived in violent and oppressive times. What if he had died by suicide instead of going on to be a great part of the momentum behind the civil rights movement? Even William Shakespeare, right? To be or not to be. What many people don't know about his young adult crisis is that he got his unwed girlfriend pregnant. What if that life-changing event had been so overwhelming to him that he had taken his own life instead of going on to write his masterpieces? Now, this campaign called Don't Erase Your Future was created by students and faculty and staff at the University of California in Irvine. Men and women just like you who got around a table and said, no more. We need to change the conversation that we're having about mental health and suicide, to help people persist through these very difficult times in their life and let them know that there's a brighter future on the other side. And that's the reason why we're here today, is to start conversations, to elevate conversations, to change these conversations so that people can deal with directly these life-threatening things that they might be facing. So thank you all so much for being here. I come from Colorado, and I want to thank you all, and especially Bernie and Sarah Eddy and Melissa Quinby and Katie Longley and Dave and the Offices of Student Life and Security and the so many people who were so incredibly thoughtful in putting together a full day today of training and conversations with students and staff and faculty. It's been a wonderful, exhausting, but a wonderful, wonderful day. I always think it's interesting to kind of hear a little bit about the person. You heard a little bit about my professional background, but I'll share with you just a little bit about kind of who I am as a human also. So I was born and raised in Connecticut, and as you heard, attended Bowdoin in the late 80s, and come from a long, long Bowdoin family. My father was class of 60, and my brother was class of 92. and I was class of '89. So this place is incredibly special to me, and it's absolutely a huge honor to come back. In 1990, shortly after graduation, I got into graduate school at the University of Denver and have moved out there and stayed there ever since, and everybody in my family has transitioned out. This is my husband, and we're sitting on the Great Wall of China in Beijing. I have a very big honor and privilege of being able to travel internationally to learn about how suicide is perceived and prevented all around the world. And it's incredibly humbling to get these little slices of ways that people are thinking about it and work that's being done and try to stitch it all together in a more robust idea about what prevention is all about. This is my strange habit of running incredibly slowly, long distances. I'm trying to do a marathon in all 50 states, and I have yet to do Maine, so if anyone has a great race in Maine that I need to know about, please let me know at the end here. I think I've done 28 marathons in 26 states, so I only do like 2 or 3 a year, so you can do the math. I'm gonna be super old by the time I'm done. These are my 3 kiddos. My oldest is now 17, my middle son is 14, and my little guy just turned 11 last week. And we were out here a year ago, June, for my 25th reunion, and these guys have their eyes on Bowdoin, so I better start saving up, because, or that, or win the lottery, I don't know. You don't make a lot in the nonprofit sector. And these are my 4 male pets, 2 male dogs, 2 male cats, and I'm pretty sure all the fish are male as well. So I lose out pretty much every night on decisions around movies and pizza and all kinds of stuff. So, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And then finally, I'm very into social media. So if folks are at all engaged in Twitter or Facebook, please go ahead and post and share some of your thoughts about tonight, or things that you're learning, or new information, or whatever you want to talk about. My handle is S. Spencer Thomas, and I'd love to hear your ideas and just share kind of more of what you're thinking with a larger audience. All right, so what are we going to do tonight? These are my goals in the next several minutes. I'm going to take you on a journey from a bereavement, my own grief around suicide and the loss of my brother, into action, and how we've started to create a social movement around these issues, and one that I want to enroll all you in. And so hopefully, when we're done tonight, each of you will have an idea of how you can participate in this social movement, and help your friends, help your family members, help yourself, but also get this larger conversation going so that people don't have to die in isolation and despair any longer. This is a quote that I always like to start off with. I'm going to share just a little bit of data around suicide issues in our country and things that we need to be thinking about, especially for young adults. But before I do that, I always like to preface it with this quote. Irving Selikoff was a cancer physician and a researcher, and he was talking about cancer, but this quote holds true for our work as well. Statistics are merely aggregate numbers with the tears wiped away. Statistics are merely aggregate numbers with the tears wiped away. So for every data point and trend that I'll share with you, I know, and I know you won't forget either, that there's a life that's been lost and that there's a family that's often been devastated. So as I say, every 13 minutes in our country we lose someone to suicide, and about every 40 seconds, we estimate, somebody is attempting to die by suicide. There are very good chances that many of you in this room have been touched in profound ways by this issue. Maybe you lost a friend or a loved one or a family member. Maybe you've known or tried to support someone who's been in the throes of a suicide crisis. And maybe you yourself have also struggled or attempted. And so I want to honor the many, many reasons why you're here. And I want to thank you for whatever reasons that you're here, and especially if you are trying to make meaning out of your own difficult time around this issue. Thank you for that. And I also want to share with you that I'm among you. This is my brother Carson. Carson was a 34-year-old business leader in Denver, Colorado. He, by all external accounts, was thriving. He had started and launched his own national insurance company at the age of 27. He had a beautiful wife and a daughter he loved so much. But what people didn't know is that he had these inner demons that he fought on a daily basis, often. Many people have what we call flashbulb memories around things that were highly significant and often traumatizing in their life. Many of you were fairly young, but I bet you could recall what you were doing and thinking and feeling on the morning of 9/11. I remember it very clearly. I was home with my middle son, watching him on my day off, and I got the news. My husband called. He said, go over to his mother's house since we didn't have a TV. You're not going to believe what's happening. And I went over there, and I can remember the color of the carpet. I can remember everything about where the TV was and watching this thing over and over again. I also have a flashbulb memory on the night that Carson died. This time, again, I was home with my children. I had just had my third son, Jackson, and I'd been on maternity leave. And while having children is absolutely a beautiful gift, I had been probably struggling with some level of postpartum depression. I was overwhelmed. I missed the structure of work. I missed the connection with my students. I was working at a university at the time. And on that night, I was going to a party that my students were hosting. It was the end of the year party on December 7th. And we were getting together, and we were going to celebrate the holidays, celebrate an awesome semester together, share stories, and I was going to catch up on their lives and catch up on all these things they were doing. So I'm driving to this party, and our home is in the foothills of Colorado in a town called Conifer. And this party was over here about an hour and a half away in a town called Brighton. And I just happened to be driving past the exit I would take if I were going to my mother's house. I can remember the smell in the car. I was bringing the ham, the main dish for the party that evening, and I can smell the cloves wafting through. I've got a poinsettia on the front seat that I'm going to give to the host family and a little secret Santa exchange gift for the students. My older son, Nicholas, who's 6 at the time, is teaching my middle boy, Tanner, the dreidel song that he just learned in kindergarten. I can even remember what I'm wearing. Being a child of the 80s, I have on a god-awful Christmas sweater and some gingerbread earrings. And that morning, I had organized my spice rack, and I thought, I'd become my mother. And I was actually totally okay with that. It was a very hopeful moment of family and celebration and connection and holidays and so forth. And then my phone rings. Now, I don't usually answer the phone, especially when I have got the kids in the car and it's night, but my brother had been in crisis for the previous 2 weeks. So I answered the phone, and it was my mom. And she says, Sally, pull over. So I just happened to be the exit I would take to get to her house. I said, well, hold on, Mom, I'm at Federal Boulevard. Just give me a second. I'll pull over when I get there. Silence. I get to the exit, I pull over. I said, okay, Mom, you're killing me. What's going on? She said, put the car in park. Our worst fears have been confirmed. Your brother has committed suicide. Now, when you get news like that, as many of you have, you know what happens next. It's absolute chaos. I'm screaming, I'm crying, I'm like, surely I misunderstand. You don't mean he's dead. It can't be true. And in the middle of all that chaos, somehow I drop my phone. So then I open the car door, and I'm on my hands and knees trying to find this phone, crying and screaming. And like a laser from the back seat, this voice comes through. It's Nicholas. 6-year-old Nicholas, who's known his Uncle Carson as this incredibly magical person who throws him up in the air like Superman, teaches him the fine arts of shooting pool, taught him how to ski down a mountain. And he says to me, Mommy, I'm crying for you. And as weird as it sounds in that moment, with all the resolve I could muster, I knew that I had to get back up into that car for the kids in the back seat, for the mother on the other side of the phone, and drive those 50 blocks up Federal with every focus on remembering red means stop and green means go. 6 months before, my brother had been on top of the world, running this business, being incredibly charismatic and funny. We called him the Pied Piper. People would just follow him anywhere. He had actually received a diagnosis of bipolar illness while he was a student at Bowdoin. Here's some pictures of us during our time here. You'll have to forgive the very cheesy polar bear 80s sweaters. We were a big fan of those 80s sweaters back in the day. There's my father, who's also a Bowdoin alum, as I mentioned, my brother playing lacrosse, my brother graduating with friends, and then the picture of us in the corner is actually the night that he dropped at the fraternity where I was a brother. And the stinker, he walked by the house and pretended he was going to Chi Psi, which was another fraternity on the campus. And I was like, oh no, you can't, you have to come here. And he turned around, he's like, just kidding. And that's the moment that he decided to join us. So a lot of very positive memories and experiences here at Bowdoin, but it was also a year that he made a very bad decision and cheated on an exam and was asked to leave for some time to sort out kind of what he wanted to do in life. And my father was so overwhelmed by that decision that he marched Carson right into the psychiatrist's office to figure out what was going on. And the psychiatrist said, I think your son has bipolar illness. And Carson came out of that meeting and said, I don't know what the heck that is, but I don't have it, and I'll be fine. I'll show you. And in that year that he was off from school, a number of things happened. And one of the things that he learned was he had an incredible gift for sales. By the end of that year off, he had a sales team from 3 different states that earned enough points selling, get this, encyclopedias. Do you all even know what encyclopedias are? Door to door, knock, knock, buy these big, heavy books that no one will ever read for about $200. He did that incredibly well, earned enough points to take his sales team to Hawaii and Rome, and he was off to the races after that in terms of understanding his business leadership and his gift for sales. So he kind of, in some ways, distanced himself from that diagnosis. He was given the lesser form of it, so that means that he had elevated mood states from a lot of the time of visionary ideas and creativity and energy and drive that were punctuated by periods of depression, where he would feel self-loathing and anxiety, and sometimes he would hole up in his basement and he would sometimes self-medicate with alcohol or marijuana, and other times he'd venture out and try to get treatment, talk therapy or medication, whatever he could do to feel better about himself or just feel better about his ability to be out in the world. And no one knew. No one knew he had these struggles until the summer of 2004. For reasons we don't fully understand, in a very short period of time, he went from this incredibly successful, charismatic center and life of the party to unraveling his life incredibly quickly. He left his business partner, which was kind of the yin to his yang. My brother was the chaotic visionary guy, and this other guy kind of held the business all together. He broke ties with a number of friends because of his agitation and irritable state. He left his wife and daughter and moved into a $1 million loft that he didn't have inspected. He bought an $80,000 car, laptops for employees he didn't have. And just one by one, he just started making all of these decisions that ended up him in a place where he was alone. And we can trace it almost to the day where his accountant said, "You're done. You have no more money. You can get no more money." And my brother flipped in a 180 from kind of this manic presentation of reckless behavior into being so filled with self-hatred and self-questioning that he was unrecognizable. He didn't sleep for a month. He lost 30 pounds. He had a tremor. He couldn't stay warm. He came home to my parents' house, and he would pace around the living room with his wool coat on, trying to stay warm, sitting in front of their gas fireplaces, chain smoking. Again, anything he could do to try to regulate this agitated state of a tortured soul. Now, at this point in time, I've had a number of years of mental health training and graduate school and practice and so forth, so I knew he was in trouble, and I reached out and I asked him, I said, "Carson, given what you've gone through, it'd be understandable if you were thinking about suicide." And he said, "I am, but I'd never do it." And at that level of my appreciation of this situation, that was good enough for me. First of all, I didn't want him to be suicidal, so I just needed a little convincing. And he gave me just enough information to be, okay, we're safe there. And then my father and I and his wife, we advocated for all different kinds of treatment. And being on the other side of that equation for the first time, I realized how woefully inadequate a lot of our mental health system is and how hard it is to advocate for appropriate care for someone who's not expressing acute suicide wishes. The last time I saw him was a Thursday. Many of us in the family and some of his friends had read the book, The Unquiet Mind by K. Redfield Jamison. It's a beautiful memoir that she writes. She's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University who lives with that more extreme experience of bipolar illness. So she writes very, very candidly about what it feels like to have those manic highs and those depressive lows. And she also writes about her near-fatal suicide attempts, but more importantly, she writes about her journey into recovery. So on that night, on that Thursday night, Carson and I sat down to chat, and he said, I can't read this book. You got to just give me the highlights. Tell me what happens. And I said, well, there's this woman. She's a very professional and public person, just like you. And she's gone through a number of experiences like you, and she's gotten better. So, maybe we can learn from her. There's hope here. There's hope, there's hope, there's hope. And he turned to me and he said, but Sally, it's madness. And less than a week later, he took his life. So, of course, he's not here for me to ask him directly about what he meant by that, but I have a pretty good idea. My brother was an incredibly determined person. He overcome all kinds of obstacles. If he had a goal, gosh darn it, he was going to do everything he could to get here. And so in my heart of hearts, I truly believe that my brother would have figured out a way to get through this dark night of the soul. He would have persisted to find something that worked for him. But instead, he had given up hope because he believed that even if he got to the other side, the life that he loved would not be there for him anymore. The business partners he had wouldn't look at him funny. The friends wouldn't question him. And that made me so mad that someone with a health condition that's largely treatable and shared by so many people has to have all of these social barriers for people to truly reach out and accept the help that can save their lives. On the night that Carson died, his good friend Sean reached out to my brother's wife and said, oh my God, what can I do? And she said, no matter what you do, don't let him be forgotten. So it was literally on the night of his death that the seeds for the Carson J. Spencer Foundation were born. December 7th, 2004. By January 2005, this man had convened many of my brother's closest friends from across his lifespan and our family, which consists of my parents and me. And we just started having conversations. Mostly it was like a support group at the beginning, remembering him, remembering the gifts that he brought to the world. But we very soon closed in on a vision of doing bold, gap-filling work to prevent what happened to Carson from happening to other people. And at the same time, celebrating the life that was lived and honoring him with dignity by doing our work in an entrepreneurial way, engaging business leadership, and using humor when we could. And so here we are, almost 11 years later, a national and international organization trying to change these conversations so people don't have to suffer like he did. As I mentioned, he died 2 weeks before Christmas, 2 weeks before his 35th birthday, which was Christmas Eve, and 2 weeks before the Asian tsunami. Again, many of you probably have some memories of what that experience was like. It was months later when it dawned on me that the international response to this unbelievable disaster had many parallels to our family's response to Carson's suicide. The first couple of weeks were absolutely a feeling of drowning. Like many traumatic experiences, night and day is flipped on its head, cues of eating and waking and functioning are just out the window. And for me, I had an overwhelming sense of fear, always. Who's next? What's going to happen? And my mind could not get off the horror of my brother's death. We decided to have his memorial service December 13th, just a couple of days after his death. And as I mentioned, we've come from Connecticut. So people were getting on planes at the last minute in the middle of the holidays to come pay their respects. And on more than one occasion, I'm driving out to the airport and I'm literally having an out-of-body experience. I am somewhere else. And all of a sudden I come to and I realize I'm driving 75 miles an hour and I have no idea where I'm going or what I'm doing. And I get completely overwhelmed by panic. Happened on a number of occasions. And then I'd have fears that something would happen to my kid. It just never stopped, never stopped. Like another metaphor with the tsunami, at some point in time, we had to resurface. And when we did, and we looked around the landscape of our lives, everything is different. Again, I was teaching at a university. I loved the work I was doing. I was working in leadership development at the time. I loved teaching. I loved being with the students. I loved my colleagues, and I loved my community. But I woke up from that feeling of chaos, and I looked around and I just didn't care anymore. I didn't care about the work. I just couldn't get motivated for teaching or these goals. And I walked into my office. This was the emergence day. I couldn't stay away from getting back to life anymore. I'd used up all my sick leave and vacation leave, and how many days did they give us to grieve a first-degree loved one? 3. And they had even extended it a little longer because it was over the holidays. At January 3rd, I had to go back to work. And I opened my office door, and I looked at my desk, and it was absolutely covered with cards and flowers and animals and well wishes. My inbox just jammed with positive, supportive messages from many people I knew and a ton of people I didn't know. And I knew that I was going to be okay, at least in the workspace. The ripple effects of his death spread quickly through space and time and continue to spread. It's gotten fewer and fewer as the years have gone by, but through the miracle of social connectedness online, people are still finding us and still learning about this story and reaching out and said, you know, he mattered, and thanks for doing what you do. The aftershocks of his death, some of them, many of them, were anticipated in that first year, all the birthdays and anniversaries and major holidays. And sometimes it was the anticipation of how we're going to get through those days that was even worse than the day itself. But it was the aftershocks that were unanticipated that were even worse. Carson and I had a song, Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You, and we just used to sing it to each other very campily at the top of our lungs. And at my wedding, we actually played that song and danced to it. And I had a photograph, and I thought I had lost this photograph that someone had taken of us in the middle of that song. It's the end of the night, his tails are all untucked, and my hair's all coming undone, but the look in our face is nothing but pure love. And I thought I had lost it. And so when I was going through this box of notes and cards and so forth, and I found it, it was overwhelming to remember that moment and to remember the joy that we had with each other. The last piece of the metaphor that came to mind was the number of different special teams that are often needed to help a family through the complicated process of bereavement. I told you about my work family. I also had a faith community that really was supportive for the long haul. I had a number of friends, many of them in the field of mental health, who showed up for over and over and over again. And all of that together really helped us through, and so I'm incredibly grateful. So why do I tell you all of this? Well, I don't want or need your pity. That's not why I share it. Many of you may have heard of the rock group Seether. His lead singer lost his brother to suicide, and he wrote a song called Rise Above It. And in this video of this song, he literally shows family members being swept off their feet after hearing the loss of his brother to suicide. But the name of the album is Finding Beauty in Negative Spaces. And I really feel like that's been a lot of what my journey has been about, is finding incredible, inspiring stories and people on this journey of what has happened since. So that's not the reason I tell you this. The reason I tell you this story is because most families don't. Because of shame, because of mystery, because of confusion, because of anger, many, many reasons. Most families do not share the story of how suicide has devastated their lives, their families' lives. Sometimes it's like a chandelier that drops and everything scatters, and for a long time you're just waiting for the next piece to crash. It's unbelievable and very challenging. But people tend to hide that behind closed doors. And when we don't know the devastating effects of suicide, we can't advocate for change because decision makers and influencers are not aware of what's needed. The other reason I share this story is because a lot of people in the throes of a suicide crisis misperceive, but believe that the world's going to be better off without them. Rather than it being a selfish act, it's for most people selfless. They believe that their loved ones will be benefiting when they're not here, that their death is worth more to the people who care about them than their life is. They believe people are going to breathe a sigh of relief. And that's so far from the truth. I would do anything to have Carson back, anything. So these are the reasons I share this story. And what I want to do now is share with you a little bit about what it means to be a social advocate for change. Yes, there's lots of trainings we can take on how to listen empathically to loved ones and friends, and how to have conversations about asking suicide questions directly and leading people to helpful resources. And we can certainly talk about that. But what I want to inspire in each of you are additional roles that you can play in elevating this conversation. So in investigating this, like how do we start a social movement around this, we look at the World Health Organization, and they offer us this definition of what it means to be a mental health advocate. The concept of mental health advocacy has been developed to promote the human rights of persons with mental disorders and to reduce stigma and discrimination. It consists of various actions aimed at changing the major structural and attitudinal barriers to achieving positive mental health outcomes in populations. So let me highlight a couple pieces of that definition. It's about human rights. It's about dignity. It's about ending discrimination and prejudice. It's about changing major attitudinal and structural barriers to positive mental health outcomes. That's what needs to happen, to give people the permission and the empowerment to reach out when they're struggling, to reduce the outcome that my brother had of feeling like there was no way he was going to be able to get his life back. So there's a lot we can do here. First, we have to acknowledge that discrimination and stigma exists and that there are major barriers for people achieving help. And then we need to speak out against that, to change those attitudes and those barriers to getting help. So how do we do that? Like many things that revolving around change, the best place we need to start with is ourself. So that's the first step, and I'm going to go talk a little bit about that. And then the next piece that we need to do is instill hope. How do we instill hope? Because what I've found is that even the slight glimmer of hope for somebody who is in the throes of suicidal thought can keep them here. And we can fan the flame of hope until it grows bright enough that they are able to stay with it. And then finally, how do we engage a wider circle in this conversation? For a decade now, we've been showing up and doing our piece, and I can tell you, most of the time, it's people bereaved by suicide and mental health service providers coming into the forefront to try to get things going. And while we're a passionate group, and we're a dedicated group, and we're a smart group, and we're a feisty group, we are a small group. And so we need to engage other people who may or may not be touched personally by this issue to say this matters in our communities, in our schools, in our faith communities, and in our workplaces, and we need your help. All right, so let's start with ourselves. The very first thing we need to unpack is our belief system that we have inherited from various messages, from our families, from our religious traditions, from the media, all the ways we get to understand how things are. And so we fall prey to those same misperceptions, and we need to start unpacking them. I'm going to give you a couple of slightly provocative things to think about, and just check in with yourself and your thoughts and your reactions to each of these statements to see where you land. The first thing is suicide is preventable. Suicide is preventable. How much do you believe that is true? Now, why would a suicide prevention person be up here asking you this question? Because it's complicated. In fact, there's a national movement going on right now advocating for zero suicide. Zero is the goal we should go for. Because how many suicides are acceptable? And what if it's your brother? What if it's your kid? Zero. And so people really have to grapple with that. If we truly believe that we can get suicide to zero, what's that going to take? How far do we need to go in really doing quality assurance to make sure that we're making progress in that area? And it turns out, when we're looking at data now in large behavioral health systems, when the philosophy of that behavioral health system and the practices are constantly working towards zero, the suicide rates drop. When we change our beliefs, our behavior changes, and our outcomes change. That said, it's hard when you have a family like ours that really felt like we did everything in our power to prevent this from happening, and it still happened, that maybe there's some piece of it that is out of our control. So I'd like to leave you with this thought. Let's think about suicide like we do cancer, right? We're doing everything in our power right now to prevent cancer from happening in the first place. We're cleaning up our environment, we're teaching people to eat well, exercise, stop smoking, etc. And sometimes we're going to do everything right, and people are still going to get sick. And when they get sick, we want to catch it early. We're going to do screening, and then we're going to aggressively go in there and treat things where things are just beginning to try to eradicate them early on so they don't progress. And sometimes people are going to get sicker. And sometimes we're going to need more aggressive treatment, longer hospital stays, maybe they have a couple of remissions, and we're going to save people that way, and sometimes we're still going to lose people. But we never took our eye off prevention the whole way through. If we do the same thing with mental health and suicide prevention, I guarantee you, we're already seeing there's an international summit earlier this week making a declaration for zero suicide and spreading the things that we know that work through our systems so that we can start really believing and executing these ideas. The second piece of a belief that I want you to unpack is this idea that mental health and physical health are different. Mental health and physical health are different. Check in with your thoughts around that. So where does a lot of mental health lie? In the brain. Isn't the brain a part of the body? When did we disconnect these two things? Physical health and mental health interact with each other all the time. They're wired together. But yet we treat them differently on a lot of levels. Physical health tends to get a lot more empathy and compassion. When somebody's arm is broken or they're bleeding, we rush over like, are you okay, man? Can I help you? Let me bring you some chicken soup. Let me give you your homework. Make sure you're caught up. But when somebody's having that level of pain, but it's internal, and it's depression or it's anxiety, instead of getting empathy, compassion, and support, they often get judgment. We don't have that same level of compassion when we can't see the physical evidence for the injury. We also have different ways of accessing care around these two things. It's a lot easier to get help for physical ailments than it is for mental health in a lot of circumstances. The last belief that I want to have you think about is this notion that talking about suicide can put an idea in someone's head. Talking about suicide can put an idea in someone's head. Again, the research would show us that in compassionate relationships that are trusting and somebody reaches out because they've noticed changes and they've noticed life circumstances, and they ask someone directly, are you thinking about suicide? The suicide intensity drops. Half of college students, by the time they reach college age 18 to 22, half of college students have already considered suicide. It is a common way that people escape pain. So it's very unlikely that someone would introduce an idea of suicide when life challenges are already overwhelming. Chances are it's already there. And the person has been struggling with not only the pain of that, but the isolation that it brings because they don't know who they can trust to have those conversations. So reaching out opens up that conversation and gives them support so they feel less alone. That said, there are ways that we talk about suicide publicly that are unsafe. When we romanticize it, when we glamorize it, when we overemphasize it, when we talk too much about the details of the death and the means and the scene. Yeah, when we talk about suicide in those ways, unsafe ways, glamorizing ways, people who are vulnerable to it can over-identify with the person who has died. And we often see clusters when there's one, there's two, there's three. So we need to have communication that is supportive on the individual level and linking people to qualified care. And then we'll see more reaching out and more help giving. The second thing we need to do is really increase our knowledge around these issues. This is a field that really was just born in the United States in terms of research in the 1950s, so very much in its infancy, but with more and more researchers examining questions of what's working for treatment, what's working for prevention. Our knowledge base around this is expanding exponentially every day. So being on top of what works, especially as you're trying to create change and help people, is something that is encouraged everywhere. All of you doing research in your different disciplines, you can start helping answer some of these questions. For example, most people don't know that in the United States, there are more suicide deaths than there are motor vehicle deaths. More suicide deaths than motor vehicle deaths. You can think about all the things that we do to protect people from dying on the road. We have technology and policy and law enforcement and education and all kinds of things. We have virtually nothing in terms of resources trying to work on suicide prevention. It's the second leading cause of death for college students. And we have virtually nothing working on that. So these are things we can advocate for. And finally, we need to increase our skill sets. It is daunting and challenging to try to have conversations about this with people that we love and care about, let alone strangers. But there are very proven strategies that help us determine when someone's at risk, how to ask directly about suicide, and how to empathically lead them to appropriate levels of care. We had one of those trainings this afternoon with the staff here. We were supposed to have maybe 20 or 30, and then we increased it to 60. We thought we would have 80. 100 people showed up. Woohoo! Very exciting. So learn about these different types of skill-based trainings, and then train yourself on a regular basis so that it's top of mind when you need to have these conversations. Hope is the antidote to suicide, and one way that we can increase hope is really understanding this model of suicide risk. This is developed by a researcher from Florida State University in Tallahassee. His name's Thomas Joyner. If you're going to read one book, read his book, Why People Die by Suicide. It'll illuminate this model more than I'll have time to tonight. And it's a very simple way in your own mind to try to figure out how much risk is this person in. He analyzed 200 known risk factors for suicide and boiled it down to 3 factors. Perceived burdensomeness, I've already talked about, the idea that my death is worth more to the people who love me than my life is. Number 2 is thwarted belongingness. We are hardwired to be in connection with other people. And when those inner circle relationships are taken away from us, it's very upsetting. So divorce, separation, getting kicked out of school, being incarcerated, losing a job, many, many ways that we lose our relationships. When those 2 things happen, a desire for suicide is common. But look, most of that bubble, not at risk. Not at risk, because it's common to want to escape psychological pain through suicide. Doesn't mean they're at risk. The other part of the bubble, called acquired capacity, is what puts people over the top for risk. Again, Thomas Joyner puts conventional wisdom on his head and says, yeah, it's not a cowardly act, it's a fearless act. The people most at risk for suicide are often fearless. People have acquired capacity for suicide from a number of places. Temperament, they come into the world of risk takers like Carson, or they learn it through painful and provocative experiences over the course of their life, or they're familiar with and have access to lethal means. All of those things, again, increase risk. But there's a bunch of people over there, no risk. Our warriors, our entrepreneurs, a lot of our athletes, our law enforcement and first responders, no risk until they get the other side of the bubble and they have heightened risk. So if this is the model of suicide risk, the model of hope is the opposite. There's not a lot we can do about acquired capacity. People's temperament and learning history are pretty fixed. We can modify it a little bit, but not a lot. And we can take lethal means out of people's access for a period of time. But we can do a lot on the other side of the bubble. If burdensomeness and isolation are increasing risk, then connection and community and belongingness and purpose are what increase hope. So as you're thinking about ways to create change around this, figure where the gaps are around purpose and belonging and start there as an upstream model. And then finally, we need to create a tipping point of change. We need to engage more people in this effort. And the way we do that is we enroll people in unusual partnerships. The year that before Carson died, I went on the Avon breast cancer 3-day walk. I had had my second child, I had put on some weight, I wanted to get back in shape. So I was gonna walk in this 3-day walk, and I had no connection to the breast cancer issue. Nobody in my life had been touched by this. But I showed up for that morning with 3,000, mostly women, joining me in the walk. A good number of them had kerchiefs on their head from going through chemo. A number of them were carrying balloons and banners honoring loved ones. And years later, when I bent back to look at that, I thought, oh, the suicide prevention movement has a lot to learn from the breast cancer movement. We need to walk in solidarity with people who are fighting for their lives. And we need to be able to honor people with dignity who have died. And we need to enroll people like the breast cancer movement. You know, my goodness, they have the NFL players wearing pink shoes. We need to enroll people who are not personally touched by this issue to stand up with us and say this matters. So what does this look like? What does the social meeting look like? It's about organized empowerment. It's about giving voice to people who have been silenced. It's about mobilizing the bystanders, the people who don't think they can have an impact, to say, yes, your voice matters, come join us. And it's about acting against injustice. How do we inform the media to tell responsible stories about suicide prevention, not just the sensationalized stories of tragedy? How do we influence our policymakers and our legislators about creating opportunities for large-scale sweeping change around education, training, and resources? And how do we champion mental health parity? So down below here at the bottom, this happened just last month. Hundreds of us gathered on the Washington, D.C. Mall and championed dignity. The march was called Destination Dignity. And it was about this conversation that, you know, people experiencing suicidal thoughts and major mental health conditions are much more than their diagnosis, and they demand to be respected. So with that, I'm going to open it up for a couple minutes of questions and just kind of see what's burning for you to see what I can answer. Does anyone have some questions? We have some mics to go around. We've got someone in the middle there. If you can reach. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering, and you don't have to get too personal about this, but what advice would you give to someone who wants to support their family members, you know, in the bereavement process thereafter?
In the bereavement process?
Yeah.
Yep. So my first answer to that is treat it like another grieving process. So what does your family normally do when someone has died? Do we gather and tell stories? Does somebody make a scrapbook? Do we have a service of some kind? And whatever you can do to kind of keep those traditions going matters. And really what people need most in that first part is just that grief experience. People need to tell stories about what this person brought to their life. They need to kind of process through the loss part and be able to share that over and over again. So just going back to whatever has worked for grief in the past, because any deviation from that kind of sparks this, why are we not doing the thing that we've done when, Aunt Susie died from cancer or a young person died in a car crash? So start there. That acknowledged, people have challenges with suicide. Sometimes there are religious issues that complicate the matters. Sometimes there's concern about secrecy and shame or protecting, and sometimes it's well-intentioned. We're going to protect the kids and start another story about this. We really encourage people to deal with it as head-on as they can. The more flowery language and new stories we put around it, it just complicates it, and we can't deal with it directly. And then the third thing I'd recommend is that people find their own way through support resources. But one thing that's really helpful for people is finding a peer, somebody who has lived experience through this already. And you might not know who that person is yet. Sometimes there are peer support groups that people can join that are suicide bereavement specific. And sometimes it's just another person one-on-one that we can talk to that helps us understand. One of the things that I've learned about suicide bereavement is because you have both the grief and the trauma together, people have to tell their story over and over and over and over again. And they tend to burn out a little bit, the neighbors and the close friends who can't hold that level of story. So that's why the peers who've already come through grief around suicide can be great resources. Yeah.
I know this is like a huge question, but I was wondering how we as like supporters can try to help our family and friends who are struggling with suicide without letting it get like emotionally overwhelming for us.
Excellent. Okay. So a couple of things is, again, dealing with it front and center. We're going to talk about this. We're going to deal with it like another health issue. Always acknowledging, I'm on your team. I'm going to help you persist through the challenges about managing this. I'm not going to leave you. And we're going to continue to figure it out, because sometimes there's a lot of trial and error in which medication or which treatment or which support group or so forth. But then there's a really important piece about self-care. If you are the primary support person for someone who's dealing with a severe and chronic mental health condition, there needs to be some boundaries set. So, you can't call me every night at 3 o'clock in the morning. I have school. I'll be there for you at 6, and we can chat and check in, but I need to put some boundaries around so I can be there for you and I can be strong. So here's how I can be supportive. I can be supportive over in this space, but we have to enroll some other people to help in this safety net. I can't be your lifeline. So setting up those boundaries, setting up some rules and some guidance of here's when I can show up and here's how much I can give, and then I have to enroll some other people. Self-care is incredibly important, because if you don't do that, chances are good you're going to burn out and you're going to get resentful with someone that you love and want to support. All right, one last question, yeah. And I'll stick around afterwards if there are other questions.
Why is suicide so prevalent in our returning veterans?
Very good question. So there's never one single reason for these issues. It's often a perfect storm of a bunch of things coming together. Many people point to trauma that people have experienced in combat, but honestly, most of the people dying by suicide are never deployed. They don't face trauma, so that's not the whole answer. Part of it is because we are in a voluntary military system. People who are enrolling in the military often have challenges pre-existing before they get into the military, and then they're not well treated, or they get exacerbated by substance abuse or other kinds of non-healthy ways of coping with their mental health challenges. But honestly, I've been doing a lot of interviewing with people who are in various branches of the military, and they tell me that the biggest challenge they face is transitioning from their military identity, where they felt purposeful and connected, and this was what they were supposed to do on this planet, into something else where they're not understood for the strengths that they bring, and people look at them strangely, and they can't connect with their peers or their partners or their children in the same way they could connect with their battle buddies. So all of that together, then you add this layer of what the media is doing with constantly pounding the drum of they're killing themselves, they're losing their, they're losing their partners, and they're getting addicted to drugs, and then they're dying by suicide. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're hearing far fewer stories of resiliency and coping and recovery than we're hearing about suicide death. So people who are in those challenges of trauma or transition or identity reformatting are not hearing the millions of stories of people who are getting through it just fine. All they're hearing about is death, and they think that's the only outcome that's going to be available to them. So it's a bunch of different pieces, and I know that the military branches and the Veterans Administration are trying a bunch of things to stop that in their tracks, but really what I'm hearing and what we're seeing is it's the stories of hope and recovery, where people are sharing, yeah, I went through a hard time, and I reached out to this peer, or I got professional services, and now I'm much better, that give people the hope to hang on and persevere until they found something that's worked. Thanks. All right, I'll close now with our next steps. So we need to build capacity, not just with our professionals, but with everybody, on how to have conversations, what to look for, and how to link people. And we like to engage what we call unusual suspects, people who don't normally show up for these kinds of things, to make sure that they have those skills. We need to create champions. A lot of this happens because it's stigmatized and people aren't talking about it. So we need to have credible leaders, people with position titles of leadership, but also naturally respected influencers in our communities to be vocal, visible, and visionary and say, this matters, it's a priority, or even more importantly, me too. When leaders can boldly stand up and be vulnerable and say, yeah, me too. At this point in my life, I was overwhelmed, I needed support, I reached out, and now I'm a better person, parent, partner, and leader because I took care of my mental health. And then we need to create a future army of leaders that are well-versed in mental health literacy and what works in suicide prevention. And then finally, let's promote resources. This doesn't cost us anything. Promoting the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, promoting the counseling services, promoting things like NAMI, Mental Health America, our support groups in our community, and so forth. Take out your phones, please. I know that's a weird thing for a speaker to say, but I really do want you to take out your phones this time. And what I want you to do is program in this number, 1-800-273-8255. This is a national suicide prevention lifeline, so this number will go with you wherever you go in the US. It's going to route locally to your area code. So if you're a resident of Maine, 207 area code, it's going to route to the local call center here. But if you travel and come visit me in Colorado, call your phone from Colorado, it's actually still going to route to Maine. And then they do what's called a warm transfer to connect you to local services where you are at that point in time. It's 24/7, it's free, there's a veterans option, there's a chat option, there's a Spanish option, and it works. The research is pretty clearly showing that people lose suicidal intensity while on the phone with the callers. They also lose the hopelessness and the despair, and this line saves lives every day. All right, so I'm going to share with you this last part is a video that we created, and what I want you to just think about is don't critique the quality of the production, because I know we can do a lot better, but what I want you to think about is the messaging and how you might be able to replicate some of this messaging here. How do you engage leaders? How do you engage unusual suspects? How do you create messages of hope and recovery and a call to action to reach out? Oh, and I'm stuck. Okay, maybe hand. We had practiced this all day. Okay, friends up in the booth, I'm not advancing. Can you help me? All right, while they're coming down to help me and running to my assistance, thank you. What I want you to think about is now imagine, keep your phones out, you're going to need them in a second. Imagine that you are in this complete darkness. I experienced my own depression when I had a perfect storm of things happen in my life, and it felt just like that, being in complete darkness with no way out. You're alone, you're isolated, and you're overwhelmed. And as you're thinking about that experience, imagine what it's like to see some shining lights of hope coming through. How good are we? I'm dancing up here, man.
PowerPoint froze up here.
Okay.
Beach ball of.
Beach ball of despair. All right, we're not going to show the video. What I want is, can I get these house lights down? We're just going to go through this last part. It's okay. Gremlins of technology. They fight me every day. You think you can rescue? I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds. It's really not. Okay. No problem. No worries. Let's just shut it down. House lights all the way down. Dark, 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 dark. All right, what I want you to do, can I get those back doors shut so we have complete darkness in here? Again, this is the metaphor for what it feels like to be in a suicidal despair. Okay. Now, I want you to lift your phones when I call out different things that are related to your situation. If you have lost a loved one, someone you care about to suicide, a friend, a family member, someone you love, go ahead and raise your phones, light them up. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. You are all shining lights of hope. When the media goes away, keep them up, and the attention goes away, the people who are bereaved by suicide stand and carry that flag forward. We've always been at the heart of this movement, and we always will be. Thank you for turning your bereavement into action. All right, put your phones down. If you yourself have ever struggled with the dark night of the soul, depression, anxiety, trauma, eating disorders, overwhelming stress, loss in your life, raise your phones. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. You too are shining lights of hope. Keep your phones up. Because when other people are going through despair in their life, you can stand shoulder to shoulder with them and say, you know, I don't understand fully what you're going through, but maybe I've gone through something similar, and I know how important it is to have support, so I'm not leaving. I'm on your team. We'll find our way through it. I have some ideas. Go ahead and put your phones down. Now, if you support this cause for any reason, either already or mentioned or in your hearts, go ahead and raise your phone. Everybody's phone should be up at this point, right? Okay, now look around. Look around. Now imagine you are that person struggling with suicidal despair, and instead of pure darkness with no way out, this is what you see. A room full of lights that say, I might not have all the answers, but I'm here for you, and together we're going to find our way out. Thank you. Now you can bring the lights up. As long as people want to talk, so have a good night. I know people need to run, and again, I appreciate you coming.